At the start of the movie, we see our main character, Nancy. She's a young woman who has just discovered she's pregnant. Right now, she's with her best friend Tabitha and nervously reveals that she's positive. When asked who the father is, Nancy hesitates, then admits she doesn't know. She's been involved with multiple men recently, making it impossible to say for sure. Since Nancy works at a restaurant during the day, she quickly heads to work. She's driving, lost in music, when suddenly, her car breaks down. Stranded on the roadside, she has no choice but to walk. On her way, she runs into Bobby, her coworker, who always rides his bicycle to work. To avoid being late, she hops onto Bobby's bike, and they speed toward the restaurant. When they arrive, Nancy heads straight to the restaurant owner's office. But here's the twist. He's not just the owner, he's her father. Nancy has just been promoted to restaurant manager, and her father wastes no time in reminding her what that means. She needs to be more disciplined and responsible because her coworkers now look up to her. Coincidentally, her father has a date later that evening. Nancy's mother passed away years ago, and after so long, he feels it's time to find companionship again. Since he'll be out, he asks Nancy to stay late and handle the closing shift. Later that night, as she's cleaning up, Nancy spots leftover food on a customer's plate. Suddenly, she feels sick. She rushes to the back and throws up. Jake, the restaurant chef and her father's trusted right-hand man, happens to be nearby. He watches Nancy carefully, his suspicion growing. Could she be pregnant? But when her father arrives and sees her vomiting, Jake quickly covers for her, blaming it on spoiled meat. Her father doesn't suspect a thing. With her father gone for the night, Nancy continues working. Not long after, Peter, a kind but mentally disabled employee, accidentally spills water on the floor. Nancy understands and doesn't get mad. But then, things take a turn. A group of teenagers, known troublemakers in the area, ride up on their bikes. They don't come to eat. They come to stir up chaos. Not wanting any trouble, Nancy immediately steps outside to drive them away. However, her pregnancy is making her more irritable, and her patience runs thin. She snaps at her employees, scolding Peter for not cleaning up fast enough. But things only get worse. The teenagers return, this time wearing masks. They pretend to order food, but their real intention is to provoke Nancy. Frustrated, she loses her cool and yells at them to get out. The kids just laugh. When Nancy threatens to call the police, one of them smirks and taunts her, saying they'll be back in 10 minutes. Furious and feeling unsupported, Nancy lashes out, not just at the troublemakers, but at her own staff. She scolds everyone, Bobby, Peter, and even Jake, for standing by and doing nothing. Jake, the restaurant's senior employee, tries to calm her down, saying the kids were just joking around and that she overreacted. But Nancy isn't in the mood to listen. Without thinking, she fires Jake on the spot. Everyone freezes. Even Jake is shocked. Despite being her father's most trusted employee and the restaurant's main chef, he's just been dismissed. Jake quickly apologizes, explaining that he desperately needs this job. He has bills, insurance, and a prescription to pay for. But Nancy doesn't back down. She stands by her decision and orders him to leave. After firing Jake, she washes her face, trying to collect herself. Bobby, meaning well, checks on her, but she snaps at him too, telling him not to act like he cares. Now she's left alone for the night shift. She calls her father to inform him about firing Jake, and he's shocked. He scolds her for making such a rash decision. Yes, the menu isn't too complicated, and yes, she could handle cooking herself, but replacing Jake won't be easy. And with the restaurant already struggling financially, they can't afford mistakes like this. Nancy could have closed up early, but with overdue bills stacking up, she has no choice but to stay open until morning. Alone in the empty restaurant, she tries to shake off the stress. She plays music, cleans up, and even dances around, flicking on the disco lights for fun. But then, something catches her eye. Across the street, parked under the dim streetlights, are the teenagers' bicycles. They're back. Nancy grabs the loudspeaker and warns them that she's calling the police, but instead of backing off, the masked teens laugh. Then, bang! They start slamming their fists against the restaurant windows. Louder, harder. Nancy panics and actually calls the police this time, but the response isn't what she hoped for. All units are currently occupied with a murder case elsewhere. It may take some time before they can dispatch an officer, and only one will be sent. One officer. That's it. With no other choice, Nancy has to hold out on her own. She watches as the masked teenagers circle the restaurant like vultures. Then, they begin their terror. While hiding in the kitchen and searching for her phone, Nancy suddenly hears a police siren. Relief washes over her. Help has finally arrived. A police officer steps out of the car and begins patrolling the area. He notices an open water tap, as if someone had just used it. Reporting back to headquarters, he assures them that everything seems under control. Nancy rushes out and describes the masked teenagers on mopeds, but the moment she does, the officer's face changes. Those kids? He's seen them before. They were just involved in the gruesome murder case he came from. The realization sends chills down Nancy's spine. The officer, trying not to alarm her, admits that he had just left the crime scene. The same masked figures terrorizing her now were responsible for something far worse. Before he can say more, bang! A masked teenager rushes in and brutally kills the officer. Nancy barely has time to react. She runs to the storage room and hides, her breath shallow, heart pounding. That's when Bobby appears. Without thinking, she grabs him and pulls him into the kitchen, both of them trying to stay out of sight. But it's too late. The teenagers find them. Nancy and Bobby are tied up, forced to sit facing each other. The attackers toy with them, making them kiss for their twisted entertainment. Nancy struggles, refusing to give in. Furious, the masked figures drag her to the back of the restaurant. But she's not giving up that easily. In a desperate move, she breaks free, grabs a knife, and slashes one of the attackers. Clutching the blade, she bolts out of the restaurant. One of the teenagers chases after her on a moped. Nancy, moving backward carefully, grips the knife tightly. But in the chaos, she accidentally stabs Peter. Shock paralyzes her. What did she just do? Before she can process it, the horrifying truth is revealed. Jake, Bobby, and Bobby's brother Jackson were behind it all. To understand how things spiraled into this nightmare, we need to rewind, back to the afternoon, when Nancy fired Jake. But before we continue, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Now, let's go back. Jake was a drug addict. He didn't need his job to pay bills or survive. He needed it to fund his addiction. Peter, his younger brother, was always forced to obey him. That afternoon, they had gone to buy drugs from a dealer. Jake, out of money, begged for credit, showing a gun he kept in his car's glove box. On their way back, high and unstable, Jake spotted a group of masked teenagers having a bonfire by the roadside. He pulled over. But he wasn't there to party. He was there to blame someone. In his clouded mind, he believed that if the teenagers hadn't come to the restaurant, Nancy wouldn't have gotten angry, and he wouldn't have lost his job. And that's when his rage took over. Without hesitation, he stabbed one of the teenagers and then opened fire, killing the rest in a brutal frenzy. The most tragic part? Peter, who knew nothing, who wanted no part in this, was forced to go along with it. And now, the real nightmare is just beginning. After killing the teenagers, Jake and Peter loaded the mopeds and masks into their car. Jake then ordered Peter to go to the restaurant while he himself headed to Bobby and Jackson's house. When Jake arrived, still fuming, he vented about Nancy's frustrating behavior earlier that day. Fueled by anger, he came up with an idea to prank Nancy by disguising themselves with masks and mopeds. Bobby and Jackson, always up for some chaos, immediately agreed. Bobby briefly questioned where the masks and mopeds had come from. Jake, keeping his secret, casually replied that he had borrowed them from some teenagers hanging out nearby, assuring Bobby there was nothing to worry about. Meanwhile, Peter had already reached the restaurant, but as he stepped inside, he noticed his hands, still covered in blood from the horrifying events earlier. Panicked, he rushed to the back and scrubbed them clean at the water tap, the same tap the police officer would later notice. Soon after, Jake, Bobby, and Jackson arrived at the restaurant and began their reign of terror, banging on the windows, lurking in the shadows, and doing everything they could to scare Nancy. As we saw earlier, their plan worked. But then the police officer showed up. Immediately, the group scattered and hid. While Nancy and the officer discussed the murder case, Jake, fearing exposure, crept up from behind and struck the officer down. That was the moment Nancy hid in the storage room, terrified. Bobby, watching it all unfold, began to feel guilty. Unlike the others, he hadn't expected things to go this far. Making a split-second decision, he removed his mask and pretended he had just arrived to help Nancy. But by then, Everything was already spiraling out of control. Then came the tragic moment. Nancy, in the heat of fear and panic, accidentally stabbed Peter. Poor Peter, he was never meant to be part of this. He was dragged into the nightmare simply because of his selfish brother Jake. But Nancy wasn't entirely blameless either. If she had handled things differently, if she hadn't fired Jake in such a reckless show of authority, maybe none of this would have happened. As Peter bled out, Jake ordered Jackson to watch over Nancy, while he and Bobby carried Peter inside to treat his wounds. But as Jackson let his guard down for just a moment, Nancy saw her chance. She bolted toward the back of the restaurant, tripping over a bag of rotten meat. And that's when an idea struck her. Meanwhile, inside, Jake desperately tried to stop Peter's bleeding. Bobby, now fully realizing how out of control things had become, discreetly grabbed the police officer's car keys. He needed a way out. At that same moment, Nancy's father, still on his date, kept calling Jake to discuss his firing. Despite Nancy's emotional decision, her father never actually intended to let Jake go. He wanted to talk things over, maybe even ask Jake to stay, but it was already too late. Jake had gone too far, and besides, his phone was still sitting in his car, unanswered. Nancy found herself in a tense chase with Jackson, narrowly avoiding his attacks. In a desperate move, she threw hot oil at him, forcing him back before ultimately having to take his life to survive. Breathing heavily, she hid under a table, her eyes scanning the blood-soaked floor. That's when she saw Bobby lying motionless, covered in blood. He had fought Jake but clearly lost. At that moment, Tabitha arrived, responding to Nancy's earlier call. But as soon as she saw the carnage inside the restaurant, she panicked and fled, leaving Nancy to fend for herself. Ignoring Tabitha's escape, Jake focused on Nancy, who had bolted toward the storage room. The sun was beginning to rise as Nancy made a desperate break for freedom. But Jake was faster. He caught up to her, stabbing her from behind before dragging her back into the restaurant. He had no idea she was pregnant. Without hesitation, he plunged the knife into her stomach and left her there, assuming she was dead. But he was wrong. Nancy slowly opened her eyes, still alive. The rotten meat she had wrapped around her stomach earlier had absorbed most of the impact, preventing a fatal wound. Jake had been tricked. Struggling to her feet, she glanced at Bobby, barely clinging to life. And that's when she finally admitted the truth. The baby she was carrying was his, the result of a drunken night at a party. With no time to lose, Nancy grabbed the police car keys and made her way to Jake's house. She had to finish this. Without much effort, she caught Jake off guard, attacking him from behind and putting an end to his terror once and for all. Weak from blood loss, she stumbled back to the restaurant. Moments later, her father arrived, taking in the horrifying scene before him. His voice trembled as he asked what had happened. This movie leaves us with a clear message. Decisions made in anger often lead to disaster. A true leader must remain calm, never acting impulsively just to assert control. Never make decisions when angry, and never make promises when overly happy. Patience and wisdom are key to avoiding catastrophe. And that's the insane story of Last Straw. What did you guys think? Let me know in the comments.